As an introduction, I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see my screen? Yes.
Súper. Disculpen que no encienda la cámara, pero mi conexión no anda
I'm sorry that I'm not turning on my camera, but my connection isn't very stable today. I will give you a short introduction, presentation. Now, as a reminder, in understanding that this session is together with certain initiatives, among them the LACPASS project, in which several of the attending countries are part of. And the second initiative is the DDCC of OMS that is looking for the interoperability between frameworks with the focus on the evolution towards DDCCs. And then we have the PAHO project that searches to continue the public goods in accordance with the other two initiatives that look for the evolution of digital certificates towards the standardization proposed by DDCC. So now, as just as a summary and maybe to comment that that public goods and LACPASS project is focused on three goals mainly. The first one was the one that was addressed last year and this year that ended with the Conectaton here in Chile, focused on having greater levels of interoperability. The certificates EUTCC were tested in that Conectaton. The second one focused on surveillance, epidemiological surveillance, and the focus is placed on advancing on certain important elements, like the certificate proposed by the WHO, advancing in terms of the IPS profile that seeks to have interoperability of patients transborderly. It's a standard of standards. And finally, also proposes in the second item, proposes expanding the application of DDCC or as an exercise towards other types of vaccination, for example, yellow fever, one of the cases. Now, in the case of the PAHO project where we're currently at, 4 enablers are stated, starting by the data set where we seek to have each country do the exercise in regards to the data set proposed by the standards, understanding that there can be differences. And as an exercise, this is great for each country as well as for the groups of countries to have this exercise and to then have instances of conversation. And this input is one of the main elements. In second place, we have the standardized data repository. And what we're seeking is to have each country have a server that supports the H7 Fire standard, which is the one that the DDCC is based on. And in the third case, it's the generation of the DDCC certificate generation. And what we hope with this, we seek that each country can generate a DDCC certificate. And for this, we have a few artifacts that we will be sharing with the countries or so that they can do this exercise. And the fourth enabler is the signature, the issuance of the certificate with a signature. But in this case, this is a desirable within the process. With the first 3 enablers, we address the elements proposed for this first stage of this project.
aquí. Bueno, y
Here,
para
just a
ser un
second.
poco más específica en lo que respecta al proyecto y a la
And to be a little
convergencia
bit more
con
specific in
LACPASS,
regard to the project and the
se ha estado trabajando en
convergence with the
distintas líneas,
LACPASS
como bueno,
project,
los
we have been
aspectos
trying
que
to
se les
work on
comentaba,
different lines.
pero
One
también
is the
existen otros
enablers that
elementos
I was
que
just
están
telling you
en
about,
el
but there's
proceso
also
diagnóstico o
other
la
elements that
madurez de los
are
países
in
en relación
diagnosis or evaluation of the
a
maturities of
DDCC,
the countries
que es una
in
herramienta que
relation to
está a
DDCC,
disposición
which
de
is a
quien
tool
quiera
that is available for those who want
aplicarla,
to apply it,
que aborda diferentes
that addresses
aspectos
different
dentro de cada
aspects
país
within
y
each
establece
country,
obviamente
and
una
obviously
evaluación
establishes a level of
cierta
maturity.
feedback es parte
And
de
certain feedback is
en
also a
proporción a
part
ese
of this.
feedback el
And
resultado
in proportion to certain
en los
feedback,
países muchas
the
veces
results
ese feedback
to for the countries. And
aborda
many times this
un
feedback
poco más allá de ser tan
addresses
específico con respecto a la
or it goes
documentación de
beyond
certificación
being more
y
specific
entrega elementos
than the digital documentation
de
of COVID
gobernanza,
certification. It talks about governance,
infraestructura, que son cosas que
infrastructure,
muchas
that
veces
are
son
things
necesarias en
that are
diferentes
many
tipos de
times
proyectos, no
transversal
necesariamente
to
a
different
DDCC.
types of projects, not only
Por
to
el otro lado están los
DDCC.
ciclos de
And on the
seminario,
other hand, we have the seminar
dentro de estos
cycles.
ciclos de
And the
seminario es
intention here with these seminar cycles
abordar la brecha, un
is
poco
to
la brecha
address the
de
gap or close the
conocimiento
gap,
en lo que
the
respecta
knowledge gap
a la
in
documentación
regard to
digital de
digital
certificación COVID
documentation
de DSCC
of
y OMS.
COVID
Y para ello partimos
certificates and
en
DCC.
octubre
And
con
for that, we started in
concesiones que
October
fueron
with
desde el
concessions
concepto
that
de
went from
interoperabilidad,
the
que lo tengo acá,
concept of
desde la
interoperability. I think I have this
interoperabilidad,
here.
una
Interoperability,
aproximación a lo que es el
an
estándar que se
approximation
basa
to the
en
standard
DSCC
that
y
DDCC is
seguidamente
based on and the
se
servers.
abordó
We
para
also addressed
empezar con el
this
contexto de lo que
to start with the
corresponde
context
al
of
perfil IPS,
the
al
IPS
International
profile, the
Patient Summary.
international patient
Y
summary.
finalmente en octubre
And then finally in
se
October,
presentó la documentación
we
de lo que
presented the
por eso los
documentation.
participantes
What happened with
conocieran
that was
también
that the participants
el
got to
proceso
know
de
it and would
interfacing
see
con los
what the
estándares de
processes were like
interoperabilidad
in the
y
relationship with
obviamente
the
con esta
interoperability standards.
convergencia de las
And
sesiones
of course, this
anteriores
convergence of the previous
global,
sessions.
etcétera. Para noviembre
And now
se
for
tiene un ciclo de
November,
seminarios para
there's
establecer
also a
lo que
cycle of
se va a
seminars that will
profundizar
also be finishing. And what we
el
seek
estándar
now
de
is to
DSCC.
go deeper
Para
into the
eso
standard in
comenzamos la semana
DDCC.
pasada
And for this,
con
we
las
started
replicaciones
last
de los
week
conjuntos de datos
with the replication from the
que hay
data
después de
set
presentar
that would go from
la diapositiva
presenting the
hacia
data
la
set
generación del
to the
documento
generation of the
LCD.
document
¿Ya? Hoy estamos
HLC
en
file.
la segunda sesión que
And now
corresponde a
we're at the second
transacciones,
session that corresponds to
la que busca
transactions,
presentar las
and it
transacciones sobre las
seeks
cuales se
to
basa
present transactions
DSCC.
on which DDCC is
Y
based.
las siguientes son el
And the
repositorio
next
de
ones
datos.
are the data
Lo que
repository.
buscamos con esto es la instalación
What we're
y
seeking with
principalmente
this
entender
is
cuáles son las
to use
operaciones
and mainly understand the
que se pueden
operations
realizar sobre el
that
servidor
can be done on the
en el
server
contexto obviamente de DSCC.
in the
Y
context,
la
of course, of
siguiente
DDCC.
es
And the
la
following
generación del
week,
certificado,
it's the
esa es la
generation of the
exercise 5.
certificate. It's a
Y
practical exercise.
bueno, y con eso seguir, luego
And
seguramente vamos a
with
seguir con
this,
otros
we will
seminarios que
later
todavía no
follow
están
up with other seminars that
definidos, pero el
aren't
objetivo es
defined
seguir avanzando
yet,
en
but
esta
the
línea.
objective is to keep advancing in this line.
¿Qué más les puedo decir? Estos
What
seminarios
else
están
can
en
I
la
tell
página
you?
de Raxel.
These seminars are at the
Si
Raxel
no
page.
tiene acceso,
If somebody doesn't
que lo escriba ahí por
access,
el chat y yo les
please let me know via the chat and I will
Estos son
share
los
the
nombres
link.
de los líderes
These are the emails of the
proyecto.
leaders
También, por un
of the
lado, está
project.
Raxel, que ahí está
Here we have Raxel on the
Carlos
one hand, Carlos
de Sense.
Núñez from Sense.
Por el lado de la Conectatón también
And then in the Conectaton, it's
referencias para
also
aquellos que quieran
a
participar en la
reference.
Conectatón.
And those of you who want to
La
participate in this
de
Conectaton,
OMS lo que está buscando es
this
probar los
is
certificados
what
a
we're
varios países que
trying
ya
to do
tienen
with this
algún
is to
tipo de
try the test
certificado.
or test the
Y entiendo
certificate. There are
yo
certain
que
countries that already
ese
have
es
certain
uno de
kinds
los
of
fines
certificates, and I
para
understand
que
that
se
this
destina esa
element will
ahí Carlos Núñez también es el
serve for this
referente.
Conectaton. And
Por
here,
el
Carlos
lado
Núñez is
de
also the
nosotros
reference.
están los
And
contactos
on Bajo,
de OPS,
we have
que
here
es Miguel Betancourt
Miguel Betancourt
Marta Velandia. Y
and
por
Marta
el otro,
Velandia.
por el otro lado también
And on the other hand, I'm also as a representative of
Así
this
que sin más
project.
preámbulo, yo creo que
And
estamos en
without
condiciones
further
de
ado, I
comenzar.
think we're
Tenemos
now
una lista de
conditions to start.
asistentes
We have
considerable.
a
Y
considerate
Alejandro, te cedo la palabra.
list of attendees. And Alejandro, I hand the floor over to you. Okay, thank you, Sonia.
Buenas tardes, voy a compartir mi
Good
presentación
afternoon. I am going to
para que comencemos esta pequeña charla. ¿Me confirman cuando se vea, por favor?
Sí se ve.
Ya, ok. Bueno, siguiendo la línea de charla y continuando lo que nos comentó Sonia, hoy toca ver las transacciones de DCC. Estas transacciones están basadas en la documentación oficial y la guía de implementación Fire. ¿Ya? La guía de implementación finalmente la interpretación de esa guía técnica. ¿Ya? Dentro de las transacciones vamos a ver 4 o 5 transacciones que son las básicas y las que permiten en parte cubrir los casos de uso relacionados a la continuidad de atención. ¿Ya? Bueno, yo ya he estado en otras charlas, no me voy a presentar esta vez, solamente decirle que estoy el líder técnico de la implementación. Mi nombre es Alejandro Medina y trabajo para el CENS. El objetivo de hoy es que los participantes puedan relacionar y conocer las transacciones asociadas a los eventos, dentro de los cuales es posible tributar y obtener el conjunto de datos. Y bueno, eso es para el estado de atención y queda asociado a la continuidad de atención. Recordando que en la guía habían dos elementos, que era verificación de estado y el otro era la continuidad de atención. Nosotros vamos a abordar este por ahora, el otro espero que en una siguiente oportunidad. Eh, el detalle, bueno, una pequeña introducción, mover el flujo de trabajo, el proceso de generación, cómo se obtiene una carpeta de salud, parte uno de los eventos, y cómo se recupera un certificado de salud o la referencia a él.
So we're going to see how we recover a healthcare certificate.
Bueno, como
So
introducción, las transacciones
as an
obviamente van a
introduction,
describir el proceso de generación de un
transactions are
certificado de
obviously
salud.
going
¿Ya?
to
Estas
describe
transacciones van
the
a
generation of a
comenzar
health
para
certificate, and
extraer
these
la evidencia
transactions are going
posterior
to
al cual
start after
inicialmente comienza posterior al proceso
they
de
start
al
initially
evento de
after
¿ok?
vaccination events.
Hay que asumir
So we have
ciertas
to
cosas a la analizar
assume
las
certain
transacciones.
things
Una
when
de
we
ellas es que la
analyze the
persona
transactions. The first one
puede
being that the
ya se
person
encuentra vacunada y una
is
tarjeta de
already
vacunación
vaccinated and that
tiene los datos asociados.
a digital solution already has the associated data.
Cada una de las
And then
transacciones.
after that, we start
A continuación,
executing each one of the
la
transactions, and
vaccinación
each
ya tiene
transaction
el evento.
has an entry and exit
Las
message
definiciones
and an event
más
indicator. The
específicas
definitions, if you want to
vienen
go
en la guía
more
de
into
implementación
detail,
de
can
DCCC.
also go in the
Les
implementation
va a
guideline
aparecer
of the
en la misma
DCC.
diapo. Ya,
The
y
links are also going
después
to be in the same
forma
slides, and this
parte de la
image that you're seeing
secuencia
here starts,
de trabajo
or it's
que
part of the
está
work
definido en
sequence
esta guía de implementación.
defined in this implementation guideline.
Este flujo de trabajo de continuidad de atención
This
tiene el
workflow
siguiente
of
paso.
service continuity has
Para que
the
se entienda,
following
queremos darle un poco
steps.
de contexto
And to
a
be
las
able to
transacciones
understand this, we want to give more
para
context so you
resolver.
can better
La idea
understand
de que
these
un sujeto, voy
transactions.
a comenzar con
The
esto,
idea is that one
va a
subject
un sitio de atención,
goes to
obviamente puede
a
confirmar su
service
identidad
center.
con
They
las
can
normas
confirm their identity
del
with
Estado
the
miembro y de acuerdo a los
regulations of
procedimientos
the
que tienen
member state and
establecidos.
according to the procedures that they have.
Y además puede venir
And
ya
also they can come
una tarjeta de vacunación que va a
with a
servir para hacer lo que se
vaccination
llama continuidad de
card
atención.
that will be their base.
Posterior a eso, obviamente
And
el
after that,
vacunador, una
of
vez que
course,
valida los
the
datos
vaccinator, once they
identificaciones
validate the
asociados, que son
information
los datos de
related
identificación
to
y
the
el
vaccination and
certificado
the
de
identification
vacunación de la
information, should
COVID-19,
give them a
se le entrega
COVID-19 vaccine.
obviamente en papel,
And the card
debe
already
tener
obviously will
el
be in
certificado de
paper
salud
and
que
it
se ha
must
validado.
have the identifier of the certificate.
Además, se debe introducir
And we also
el
have
conjunto
to
de elementos básicos,
introduce
se debe capturar
the set
del
of basic
paciente
elements that needs to be captured from
los
the
datos básicos para
patient
el contenido de la ADC.
for the contents.
Y obviamente
And of
considera en los casos
course,
que se
it
deberá entregar al
considers
titular
the
una
cases that it
tarjeta,
need
al
to
menos en papel
deliver
del registro, de algo
the holder a card, at least in paper, for
obviamente
their
con el
vaccination record.
identificador.
Of course, it has to have this
Aquí tenemos
identifier as
varios
well.
casos. Uno de ellos es
Here we
el
have several
personal
cases. One is that
vacunador o el personal encargado
the vaccinating
digital de
staff
vacunación.
introduces the
Puede
vaccination
ser offline, puede
information.
ser
It can be
puede
offline,
ser en
online, it
papel.
can be on
En ambos casos
paper.
se registra en papel
In some cases, we record this on paper and then this is taken into the digital solution. And then once we key in all this information, they have to match with the basic data of the DDCC. We need to tax it and send it to a generation service so that this data is registered and saved and using PKI technology, because we call it this because we don't have a specific definition. And later, as an option, the holder, and this takes us to another process, the holder can obtain access to the record in digital form. I think that in several countries, the system is similar to what we're commenting right now. As a summary of the transactions, and we will assume that the vaccination event already existed and that it's registered in a digital solution, and the digital solution must initially send the vaccination event. This is a transaction and the documentation as done in English. It's called submit health events. And it's sending this data questionnaire towards the generation service. And within the generation service, we have the entire logic related to the signature and generation and storage and registration of the resources, in this case, the fire resource. And then after the storage and registration, there can be another event. We can obtain the folder for immunizations or associated documents for the patient. We can also obtain a certificate. And the use of this can be for validation and be just to verify that they exist or other undefined reasons. And here we will see the transaction, submit health event, which is when we include the information, the data. This is the main event. And if you saw this here on this slide, we can see that the generation service does two sub-processes or one or two sub-processes to store and register. So this is the main event that we're pointing towards, that you can achieve this through the enablers that we're generating for the project. The process of sending the event includes the digital solution and the generation service, and it includes the following scenarios. So it can include a paper record or a digital connection without internet, or a digital access without any connection, or a digital connection online. In every case, there has to be, at some point, there has to be a digital solution that can take this data to the generation service. In the sending message, there's a record, a resource that is based on DDCC submit health event request. And obviously we're going to approach FIRE. And here's where we start using the previous presentations and the enablers of having certain knowledge in FIRE. And this is a bundle resource. It's batch type and it can contain one or more questionnaires, meaning that at the end of the day, there can be several vaccinations, and then we can do this registration and this sending, and this can be, we can send one or more questionnaires from different patients. This is supported, and this can be used with one or several. This batch can have one or more resource from the questionnaire, and this is the main resource the digital solutions are going to have to use this questionnaire resource, and this is going to have all the data defined at the core data set. The data of the questionnaire response has all the data that we have seen in the data set, the name, the identifier, all the data related to vaccination, and the data related to the certificates. This resource is very important, as I said, and this is the one you're going to have to be using in the establishments that are going to include this information. And based on this data, we generate all the other processes. And here, the image, you can see the example of the terminology or where we look for it in the vaccine or the brand and some validation, certificate validation data. Now, the information related to the vaccine is also in the dose. When we put in the questionnaire response that comes with the data that we saw in the previous presentation of the data set, this data is transformed and it transforms to a model that allows a friendly handling of information. And this is called DDCC, Core Data Set VSCOC. And this is the logical model. And based on this model that you're seeing here on the right, is when all the resources and operations related to the health certificate will be generated. So this model that you see here is the one that will finally be a part of the content of the QR. And also has all the elements with which the resource is going to be generated. The patient, the immunizations, the document reference, all this information is used for this generation. The generation service has several responsibilities among it. It has to be doing the content of the questionnaire response in the logical model, and this is the core data set. And it uses, in this case, there isn't a direct proposal, but the example and what we're going to see in 2 more weeks, that is going to be an example of this. It uses the same logic that the UTC, meaning that here we will use a different base, but the operations are going to be the same. We have a signer that is going to calculate the hash of the document. It's going to be signed also, and the document will have the resources and will have the signed hash so that it can be later validated. And this also considers a validation of the document, and the solution can take with a public key and can decipher the signed hash and can do the comparison and calculate the hash based on a document and do the comparison to verify the validity of the document. The generation process will finally receive a bundle like batch response type. Remember that initially a batch is sent, and in FHIR, that response is called a batch response, which will contain the generated certificates, and each certificate is going to contain a bundle directly with the entire structure, but it will only maintain the names of the resources. It's going to be a bundle document type, and it will include all the documents that are on the right. It's a composition that has a description of all the other elements, the data of the patient, the document reference, and the immunization data, and a later immunization. This means that based on the core data set and the questionnaire response, we will have all these data transformed to FHIR resources. Another process, it's one of the processes that is done internally on the generation service, is the store health certificate, which is the storage, sorry. And the generation process, in this case, storage, will involve these 2 stakeholders, that the generation and storage service, and it's a repository service. Obviously, this allows storing this health certificate. The message is internal. The application that is generated or that is in charge of this service will have to build a message of this type, which is a bundle transaction type, and will contain all the elements. And what it has here,
voy a empezar de nuevo
and I'm going to start
diapo porque,
again with this slide because we have to understand this. It's a transaction bundle that will have within a document bundle with a health certificate. So it will have this structure, and that means that this is going to be as a full record. The bundle of the document type that is a DDCC document is a static record of the data, and all the resources are going to be associated. It's going to have a creation date. It's going to be just as it could be reflected in a document. Obviously, this is responsibility of the generation service to create the document, to create the QR, and then send the message to the storage service. The image, if you can see, and you can see this is part of the documents in the link. Down there, it's going to have a composition, the patient, the document reference data, immunization, and it's also going to have, in this case, the signature. The response message, since it's a transaction, as per FHIR, it's going to be a transaction response type, and it's going to contain the reference to the stored certificate. It's a similar response. It's going to be a bundle, and then the bundle is going to be registered. And with this ID, obviously, it could be later be recovered, leaving aside all these security aspects recommended by the guideline. So the countries have to define this. The next step, once the certificate is stored by the generation service, the next thing is to record the certificate, the health certificate, and this is done obviously linked to actors from the generation service and registration service. The sending message that the registration service has is based on the MHD provide document bundle transaction ITI 65 declared in the MHD guide, and you will be able to recover the link from here. And in case you cannot see it, you can see this, you can see the detail of the transactions, and you have the link to be able to access and see what it's really about. In summary, the ITI 65 allows us to track a document between the origin and the destination. And now this record has to generate another element, which is a list type document. It's document reference. It also has a health folder in this case, which is a list type resource, and the patient's information. And I reiterate again that it's responsibility of the generation service to compose and send this message. This is going to be sent to the service, and the response, since it's a transaction, is going to have a transaction response with the location of each one of the elements. Since you're seeing the way that you're seeing this on the right side of the page. How do we obtain this once the process finishes and with the registration event? The generation service should respond to the digital solution, the certificate, and then afterwards we have the details on how to obtain the folder, the health folder of an individual. And this can be done in two levels. A level that we're covering now, which is at verification level. And we can also do this from a digital solution with a generation service. We can initially address the service or the use case for verification. So what does the folder, the health folder have? A search request where we can add certain parameters we can search for patient status and the type of assignment or date or code, and it will search on the server or the registration service. The elements that were created before will be able to do a search, and then it will obtain a list or a resource. Oh, one is the results of a search, can be many list resources, and each one of the list resources will have the references to the documents, to the DDCC documents detailed. As you can see, this as a response message is going to be a search. The type of response will be a search set, and this is obviously based on the search rules of the HL7 fire, and it will obtain a resource, a list type resource, and additional to the information, there will be a reference to a document. And this document reference is the one that finally has the link to the storage service where we finally have the DCC document. Now, after obtaining the link or the document reference, what can be done is obtaining the health certificate, using that reference, and it can finally obtain the documents. And the idea, obviously, is to address that scenario and have a health certificate. And the reason for this health certificate has to be defined for each country, and we can identify that what was initially stored still exists and also makes way for all the operations related to the verification. The sending will be the reference that we found on the previous step, and with this, we will obtain this document reference with the location of the DS document, as we can see down here. And this would be this location that could be recovered. The implementation guide has all the documents, everything is there in the implementation guide of the DDCC, where you will find the information that I just gave you, additional to other information, as according to the structure and everything that we have seen. And now I want to open so that you can ask questions if there's any doubts about any transaction, something that we can discuss here.
Alejandro, Fernando, ¿cómo estás?
Alejandro, Fernando, how are you? How's everything going? I had, and we've spoken about the need for the use of lists. What are we going to be using the lists for? That's my question. Within the DDCC, is there a specific use? Yes, the use of this list type resource is that it's going to have one reference to a patient certificate or many, if, for example, if there's a vaccination event, here the folder of this list resource will have one reference or several. If there used to be 2 vaccination events, we should have these events registered in the same list. Therefore, you can obtain the history of this patient and in regards, in this case, to the vaccine. This is the use. And what would be the difference from having it directly in the document reference? That also has a similar use. The document reference is the reference to the certificate. And we mentioned this as well because there's also the possibility that the certificate and eventually be in a storage service that will have to have the structure, and it's going to be stored in Fire. And the registration service would be at another Fire record. This could cover this type of case. There isn't any other type of definition. We hope to have the document reference to have reference to something in the list groups all these references. And then later, it could be that there's a possibility, yes, to eventually have the document directly here, and we could just skip the document reference but from here we would be skipping from going to the TNHD. Yes, maybe skipping the list. Yes, so there's another operation, and it's an operation that we're not covering here that can be obtained and to directly query on the reference. So here, there's a transaction that is defined in the documentation where I could query the references and obtain them under a certain criteria. So I'm going to show you that because this transaction, since it wasn't part of this process, I didn't include it, but we can see it in the documentation. If you just give me a second, we will be able to see it here. You can see the documentation directly into the transaction list, which is exactly what I just showed you. The storage, registration, and here, a record, and here we have obtaining a reference. And this is the ITI 68. It's based on this. And here we could have a reference to a certificate. From the document reference? Yes, from the document reference. Actually, we can go see it. Is it possible to see this documentation and do this directly here? I have to see, let me see. Document consumer. It's also a document. Retrieve documents. Here we have the roles. And here I wanted to see other information.
Sí, mira, ahí está.
Sí, quería ver el
Here,
documento.
I wanted to see the document, the direct example.
No lo puedo encontrar aquí.
I cannot find it here.
La definición solo del actor.
Here we have the definition
Con los artifacts, de pronto.
with the artifacts.
Sí, debería verlo ahí. Yo quería ver
It should be here. I wanted to see
se refiere la
what
documentación.
artifact the documentation refers to.
A ver, dame un segundo que puede
Just give me a second.
equivocado de transacción, ¿ya?
Maybe I have the wrong transaction here. I have ITI 67. I think I clicked on 68. Here we have find document reference. Here we have the search query, and we could eventually address the transaction with this. And the search query will consider these parameters down here. The author category creation, we have to have the patient always identified, the status, but eventually it could include ITI 67. As per the definition of DDCC, ITI 67 is to verify the existence of the document, that it's part of what we're covering with the other case. Is it clear, Fernando? Or did I answer your question? Or else we can just keep verifying. Fernando, are you there?
Hola. Sí, no,
Yes, yes. What I was saying is that in practice, I hadn't seen much use for it, but now we will have to see what it works for. Because we don't really use this implementation. It wasn't necessary, and we will have to see what this is
Sí,
for.
es que, lo traté, bueno, en este caso,
Yes, in this case, this
porque
transaction
de
is
buscar en la
issued
carpeta de atención,
when
en
we
el folder del
search
evento que está
on the
ese
folder
reference
for the event that is down there, and we
por lo tanto, ya
recover
tiene
all the document references. So the reference is
la
always, it's
carpeta,
already there.
Ah,
Retrieve
sería para armar
folder.
un bundle completo, podría servir.
So it would be
Sí.
to build
De
a
hecho, va
a complete
con esa
bundle.
con la carpeta
Yeah,
se podrían obtener todas
with the
las referencias,
health
los documentos. Ya,
folder, we could
estaría
obtain
esa cuestión
all the
así,
reference
ya estaría.
now.
Ya.
It would be ready.
Pero obviamente, si
That
quiere
would
buscar
be
solamente
the
el document
reason.
reference,
Now, if we only want to look for the
directamente
document
descargar el
reference
informe
through
de
another
verificación.
characteristic, we would have to do that. We could do that.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Any other question?
La idea es que quede súper claro para ustedes.
The idea is for it to be very clear for all of you.
Es importante que se puedan entender ciertas transacciones.
It's important to be able to understand these transactions. The other thing was in relation to the questionnaire resources. This is for,
Es como entrada de datos, básicamente.
it's like the data
Exacto.
entry, right?
Sí, la entrada de
Basically.
datos. De hecho, para que esté claro, en el
So for it to be clear,
obviamente,
in the submit health
considera
event
al servicio de generación, lo que se
that
envía
considers the
es
generation service,
lo mostramos
what
en
we
la
send
presentación.
is a questionnaire that we showed in the presentation.
Ya, obviamente este cuestionario no va a tener elementos, pero
And
podemos
this
ver
questionnaire will
aquí
not have elements.
los elementos que se componen. Yo de
And
hecho
we will be able to see here in the example, all the elements here. I took the one that was in the presentation. This is the one that has all of the data. And based on this data, we start doing all the operations. Obviously here, it's a friendly view, and the non-friendly view that has another structure, a resource structure. And this is the narrative. And it says name, value stream, the value, think ID birthday, and value date. And here we have the summary view. And here we will have all the other elements. And this is a digital solution that will send the data to the creation service. And this is the resource that should be that it should have. The other tasks and the creation of all the other elements should be managed by the institution internally, the one that is going to be in charge of the generation service.
Y el proceso es, va del cuestionario.
And the process is, it goes from questionnaire, from DDCC, core data set, and from the core data set, all the other resources are derived. And then you send it to the fire structure? Yes, because in this case, the core data set is the example, the comparison with the EUDCC, and this would be this in a reduced version. And at the end of the day, this is the one that has to create the series and apply the transformations and then generate the QR code.
Ok, y esto queda en
And
una estructura específica.
this will be in a different specific structure. It's defined here in the artifact. This is a new profile. That would be a new resource. Yeah, it's a logical model here where we have all the other models, including Smart Health Card. And one of these is the one that we're seeing now. And this is the structure, what you're seeing on screen. If we wanted to compare it, it would be a structure that could be compared with the elements of the EUDCC elements of and the SV colon T colon, that definition. This is a proposal. And how different do we see this from immunization? Why not use immunization,
Que es un recurso, digamos, nativo.
which is a
Ah, ya,
resource?
perfecto, ya.
Oh, yeah,
Perfecto.
perfect. I
Sí,
understand.
este
pega
modelo
todo.
es
This
un modelo
model,
lógico para trabajo. La idea
this
del
is a
modelo
logical model
es
for
que
work, and the
pueda
idea of the logical is that, that they can facilitate the extraction and query of the data. That's why here we don't have resources.
¿Se entiende? Es para consulta
Do you
rápida.
understand this? This is for a quick consult.
Entonces, yo cuando entro,
So when I go in,
realizo un proceso
I do a process related to interoperability and I communicate through the standard and all that. But internally within my business, I transform the data into a model that I can manage myself. And then externally, I'm going to try to reduce that to be able to quickly access all the elements. And this could be included in this model. And part of the definition, it's part of the definition of the logical model. It's friendly, it's user-friendly, that's a word.
Bien. Y con relación a los códigos del CIE,
And now in regards to the codes
¿definido algo?
of the CIE 11, has anything been defined or is it open
A nivel de operación,
at operation level?
no he visto avance en
I
relación
haven't seen any
algo extra que
progress
exista.
in
O sea,
regard to anything
la
extra that
definición, los
exists.
códigos de
The
CIE 12,
definition
las traducciones,
is the
disponibles en
codes,
la guía.
the translations are available by the guideline.
Ya. Yo puedo tener todas los concept map
We can have all the concept maps between terminology,
Ujú.
¿ya? Entonces, la idea es que se pueda hacer uso
and
de
the idea is to
puede
be
ser
able to
una cosa
use
es cómo
this.
me comunico y la otra es cómo yo mantengo los
One thing is how I communicate, and another thing is how I maintain the codes.
Bien.
Sí, recuerden
Gracias.
que toda la información y todo lo
Remember
que
that all the information and everything that we're talking about is in the guideline and the artifact sectors. We have all the elements that we're dealing with. The elements define the transactions are all here. The model of the core data set, the questionnaire response, the example of a questionnaire response, the elements that the health certificate has, the DCC immunization recommendation, which is a future vaccination. We have other elements related to the composition of the document, in this case, the bundle. And having said that, this is a DDCC document that I also showed you the presentation. This is the structure. I'm sorry, I think I made a mistake here. Here we have an error in the guide. This is the TR, this one. It's based on a DCC document. What elements do you have if you wanted to know what details you have, what elements it has in detail? You include the identifier, the bundle is a document type bundle. It has, the entry has the composition, the patient, the organization, the document reference, the immunization registration, and the recommendation. And additionally, it can have the signature.
Perdón, el DDCC QR es
Sorry, the DCC QR is what part? Let's just move forward. It's a document reference type resource, and we're going to go directly to the consult. And it can have 3 elements, and I think the 2 are mandatory, and I don't have this response directly. But what it has is an image. It has the image of the QR. Directly, we have the image here. And the image, this is in flat text. PDF? One of the elements is a PDF, and the other one is a BS64. Yes, this one. The serialized value of the image. And the other one is a PDF which is the same image but in PDF. This is a PDF of the QR. So if you wait a second to see how we can see this, I don't really have an example right now. But in 2 more weeks, when we can address the other presentation, you will be able to see this QR directly. It's going to take me some time to recover this information. And it would be good to have this example, but this example doesn't exist. The system that we are using right now that we're basing ourselves on is a code from WHO. And this code had certain functionalities, but we're adapting it and correcting certain things. And among this, it's the generation of this PDF. And here we would have the QR, and it can be annexed to that healthcare card and what is sent later to the digital solution, and we could annex this here.
Es QR, hoy está hablando sin firma, ¿no?
So it's a QR. It's a QR that has a content signed. So we will have to use the same criteria. So I was telling you that before, since there didn't used to be a direct definition, we were using the definitions of the UDCC. Therefore, that's the same process. The difference is that the core data set changes and we use the structure as per the core data set. And that is the one that is finally used and compressed to be part of this QR.
O sea, todo el proceso previo se utilizaría aquí también.
So all this process would be here as well. Sorry again.
Como
I
firmamos,
did-
como se firmó
So
en EU,
since it was signed
en el DCC, perdón,
in the
se
DCC,
firmaría aquí y esa es la información que
would
va
be signed here, and this is the information that would be stored here. Yes. When verifying and taking the information away, we will reach to the same core data set. This would happen when verifying the QR, and it should reach directly a structure like the core data set. And these are the data that could eventually be, if it could be a part of the data, because it would ensure that the data was generated with a private key related to a public key. And we could then verify the validity of the certificate. This is important for the PKI structure that defines the guideline. This is the main engine of this.
Si es blockchain.
Is it about blockchain? It's part of the conversation. It's a definition from the countries right now. It's just, at the end of the day, it's based on this. So I don't really have any other definition for this, because we base everything that is being generated in this implementation guide and the technical guide, and the technical guide doesn't really give any guidelines on what is the real architecture. It just leaves it to be defined by the member states, states that are going to be part or are part
Gracias.
of this project. Thank you.
Alejandro, hay una mano levantada de
Yo no puedo
Michelle.
ver.
Alejandra, there's one hand up.
Ya, dame un segundo.
Just a second.
Dice.
Good afternoon.
Perfecto. ¿Tiene audio? Sí.
Sí, sí, sí.
Do you have audio? Yes, yes.
No, no, yo tengo algunas dudas.
I have a few doubts.
En el servicio de Submit, cuando se
On the
envían
submit
los
service,
cuestionarios,
when we send the
los
questionnaires,
eventos,
each one of the events,
a ver si lo entiendo bien.
see if I'm understanding this correctly.
Servicio, digamos, lo
This
presento
service, I
en
presented
intermedio que está delante
in an intermediate
del
component
que vaya a usar.
that is, depending on the file that I'm going to be using, this component will be in charge of creating the information from these questionnaires and consuming the resources, the necessary resources. So looking at the patient, generating everything related to the questionnaire. And in this case, would it be correct in this component, when we read the questionnaire, to build a transaction type bundle so that this is built all at once, or do we have to do this one by one?
Armar el bundle, pero ¿para qué armaría
Building
esa
the bundle, but what would you build a transaction type bundle for? With what resource?
En el cuestionario que me viene,
In the questionnaire,
información cuestionario, debo
this
generar
information, I have to generate certain
por
information.
ejemplo, y entre otros.
For example, patient
La
information,
pregunta
among
es
others.
si
The
esa
question
generación de esos
is
recursos
this generation of
la
these
debo hacer a
resources,
partir de un
I
bundle
can do it
transaction o debo
based
hacerlo uno por
on the bundle transaction, or I have to do them by one by one. In this case, part of the request or the proposal in one of the elements or the responsibilities of the generation service is to create the element. I don't really dare to say exactly that you should follow a single development line. This is related directly to the development, but in practice, a bundle, a transaction bundle, or bundle transaction is created, and it's the one that we saw in the service
En el ITI 66.
in the ITI 66. So one of these, this is a record, but where
es en de generar.
is it going to be created and generate and store? Generate and store is where that transaction type bundle needs to be generated. Here, we save all the resources separately, and then after storage, we generate the documents.
Momento donde se guarda todo
So it's a
eso.
bundle type it's a
el
document type bundle. Yes, it's the image, the documents,
El análogo del CA, digamos.
as if it were the analog. Yes. Yes, and one of the reasons, and this makes sense because this transaction, we could even consider it optional because we could go directly to the document type bundle and
Claro.
store the data directly.
Los servidores que se usan tanto para repositorio
And
como para
what
registro
is the servers that are used for repository and registration necessarily have to go through Fire? Yes. Since this is a test, and we should get to this point, we could define you to use the same. But if you wanted to separate the storage from the record, then eventually it should be like that, yes. But it all depends on an internal decision.
Perfecto. Y la última es
And
más
the last one,
técnica. En los perfiles, en cualquiera de ellos,
and the profiles in any of those,
nombra explícitamente las
does
entradas
it
que tiene que
explicitly
tener
name
el
the
perfil. Por
entries that the
ejemplo,
profile has to have?
en el de
For example,
cuestionario dice que
in the
es,
questionnaire,
es
it
un
says that,
servidor,
well, it's a
bundle
profile
también,
that we
debe
know it's a
generar tales
bundle,
entradas que
and it
tienen
has to
un
have
o el
certain
nombre a las entries,
entries, and
pero
it
ese nombre
gives
está
a name to the entries. But this name is informative. Yes, it's informative. These names are just informative, but they have to comply with this with the resources. So if it has an X type of resource, it has to comply with the fact that it has to have that resource. So how would the profile um, um, tag or label? So we could maybe not add the profile tag, and that resource can be this resource that you're sending has to be validated or should be validated against that profile. Perfect. Let's say it in a different manner. It should comply with the profile. And comply, I always mean the data, the mandatory data, and any fixed data characteristics. Basically, with the struct definition defined here. So with this, we can look at all the structure definition, and if we want to reach this, and looking at it as an example, I am going to see, I'm going to look at the patient. Let's look at the patient directly. The example, the most common example should be that the patient, sorry, just a second. The patient is asking for an identifier, asks for certain variables, it's asking at least for one name, um,
Habría que cumplir con eso.
the
Un
optional
paciente solo con
gender.
nombre, sí,
A
podríamos
patient
colocarlo.
only with the name wouldn't work.
Ahora, no quiere decir que si yo uso ese perfil pueda
So
mandar
it doesn't mean that if I
otra
use a
información
profile, I cannot
que
send
esté
other
dentro
information that
del
is
recurso paciente,
within
base, digamos.
the patient resources.
Ya, ahí entramos en detalle un poco
Here
más
we
complejo
would go
porque
into a more
habría
complex
que definir
detail
si
because we would have to
el
define
perfil acepta
to see if the profile
cerrado o
accepts the
abierto.
data
De verdad
and if it's
no tengo,
closed or
no tengo ese
open.
conocimiento
And I
tal
don't
vez,
really have that knowledge
pero
at that
tenemos alguna
level,
forma de dejar, uno
but I think
podría
there's a
eventualmente
way
dejar data
where
adicional
we could
o
leave
sencillamente
additional
cerrarlo.
data
Por
or
ejemplo, en
just
la
close the
extensión yo
data.
puedo decir
So
que
for example, for the
solamente puedo
extensions, I
aceptar
could
esa
say
extensión y nada
that
más.
I'm going to accept
Y
2
las dos
extensions and no
extensiones
more.
como ejemplo están
And the 2
obligatorias.
extensions that I put as
Coloco esa
detail
y
are
coloco nada más.
mandatory.
Ahí podríamos
So if
decir
I
que
put that
cerramos.
one, I couldn't
Claro.
then
¿Ya?
put
Por tanto,
anything else. We could
limitar
say it's closed.
eventualmente, basado en
And then
eso,
I could eventually
sería
limit
las
based on
reglas de
that
structure definition
with the rules of the structure
limitar
definition.
el perfil
I could limit the
para que haga
profile
exactamente lo que yo lo
to
quisiera
do
y no
exactly
aceptar
the
otros
same thing that I
datos
want,
si
not
eventualmente
accept any
es
additional data, if I could eventually do that.
¿ya?
Ah,
En
claro.
este caso hay muchos datos que son opcionales
In
de
this
0
case,
a 1,
there's
hay algunos
many
datos
other
que
data that are
según
optional
la
from 0 to
definición, en este
1.
caso el nombre,
There's
hay
other
algunos
data
nombres
that according to the
obligatoriamente
definition, for example, the
determinados
name,
en su uso
if I
y
define the name, I
determinados
have
en
to
el formato.
mandatorily define
Si
its
quiero
use,
agregar,
and I have
si
to have a
agregar el
text
apellido, los family en el given,
if I want to
aquí según
add
esta definición
the
es opcional.
last name or
Obviamente
family
siempre
name.
se
As per this
recomienda
definition,
tener
it's
toda la
optional.
data posible
Obviously, we always
para
recommend to have as
que
much
se
data as
pueda
possible and
dar
have it
mayor soporte
structured,
a ciertas
because
búsquedas.
there we can
Hablando siempre
give
de las
greater
secuencias de
support to
fire, que
certain
cargas
searches,
o
talking
reglas
always
mínimos de
about
esa información.
the fire server that has to consume that information.
Ah, claro. Bueno, gracias.
Thank
Ok,
you.
¿hay alguna pregunta? Sonia, ¿quedó algo?
Questions, Sonia?
Veo la pantalla de chat directamente, así que
I can't see the chat window directly.
Un comentario de Pablo
One comment from Pablo on the chat.
sí, perfecto. El problema de no haber utilizado.
Okay, perfect. The
No sé
problem
si
not having
se refiere
used.
a lo que estábamos comentando
I don't know
recién.
if it refers to what we were just
Claro,
talking
sería un
about.
problema no haber utilizado los recursos
Yes, it's a
originales.
problem not to have used the original
No
resource.
tengo esa respuesta
I don't have
directamente
that
y nosotros también
direct
nos hicimos la misma pregunta.
response.
Si vamos a
And we asked
necesitar,
ourselves the
si
same
vamos a
question.
enviar datos
If we are going to send
de
data
una solución digital hacia
from a digital
ese
solution
servicio de generación, ¿por qué no
towards that
enviarlo
generation
desde los
service,
recursos?
why not send it
Entonces
directly in
también
the
nos preguntamos
resources?
eso.
It's also a question that we ask ourselves.
Ya no tengo la respuesta directamente.
I don't have the answer
Puede ser
directly.
que nos permita también
It can be that it also
enviar
can
nuestro
allow us to send
Ahora,
an entire structure.
sí, tendría que tener un mayor conocimiento
Yes,
de Fire para
we
poder
would have to have
gestionar
more,
eso.
a greater knowledge from Fire to be
Pero
able
no,
to manage that
sí, yo creo
information.
que
But
más
I'm
que
not
una
really
sola
sure.
respuesta, yo creo
I
que
think that more than a
requiere una
single
discusión
response,
más
I think
larga.
it's a
¿Ya?
reason for a longer
Para ver por
discussion.
qué no mandar los recursos directamente.
Why not send the resources directly?
Internamente se hace, se trabaja con Transactions,
It's
se
done
trabaja con
internally. We work with
internamente con el
transaction
cuestionario de respuesta.
and with a
Puede ser
resource,
que la
but we work
definición
with
en el
the
cuestionario
questionnaire response. Maybe
tiene una
it's
base,
from a
una base
questionnaire or it has a
con
technical
ciertos modelos
base,
de
but it
captura
has
de datos definidos en
certain
Fire.
data
Así
capture
tiene que ser así.
models defined on Fire, and it has to be done like this.
Y no sé si puedo llegar a eso directamente.
I don't know if I can actually reach
Tiene un
that
nombre,
directly, but it has a name.
tiene un nombre este cuestionario
This questionnaire has a name
y en lo que está basado, pero esto,
and what it's based on.
¿ya? Entonces, hay una guía de implementación
So
en
there's an
Fire que se
implementation
llama
guideline
Structured
in
Data
Fire
Capture,
that is called
¿ya?
structured
Y
data
tiene ciertas
capture,
definiciones. No he entrado
and it
directamente
has
al
certain
detalle,
definitions.
pero
I
sí
haven't gone
la
directly
información la
in
logro hacer
detail, but yeah, to
mediante
obtain
una
information, the
encuesta.
logic is to do a questionnaire.
Esa finalmente podría ser un acercamiento
And
hacia
this could finally be an
gestor de datos.
approach to that response on how to directly manage the
Ya,
data.
eso. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? De hecho,
Any other
está el link
questions?
para que lo puedan ver ya.
So there's the links.
Están navegando la información, van a poder
So
sacar
if
las
you
distintas guías, los
are
distintos soportes que tiene este
surfing the
workshop.
information, you
Recuerden
will be able to
siempre que
look at the different guidelines and
nuevamente
different
que
supports that the
dependencia
workshop has.
directamente.
And remember that this depends on the department. And here we have the sub-department.
¿Dónde lo veo? El
Where do I see this? MHD profile.
Tiene temas de ADNA en este caso.
And here, in this case, we have it. There are some other
Y aquí está la
guides of the
descripción
IPS
básica
profile,
de
and here we have the
capacitación,
review.
¿ya? Así que ahí tiene
So
su
here
documentación.
you have the
Eso quería
documentation base
llegar a ese punto ya de
if you want to reach that
Ya,
point.
eso. No sé si hay
So
algo más, alguna otra
I don't know if there's
pregunta.
anything else, any other
Sí, o
questions,
la comentamos y
any doubts, please just let me know.
No, Sonia,
No, Sonia?
Sí, gracias Alejandro. Si no hay más
Thanks,
preguntas,
Alejandro.
podemos dar por
So if there's no
finalizada
further
esta
questions,
sesión.
we can close today's
Y
session.
bueno, dejarlos invitados
And
para la
I
próxima
just want to
semana, que
invite
vamos
you
a
for
estar,
next week
la siguiente
that we
sesión es
will be
enfocada
having the next session focused on
al
the data
repositorio
repository
Así que
on the
quedan
Fire
invitados, así que
server. So you are all cordially invited next Friday at 3 p.m.
Muchas gracias.
Chile time.
Y
Thank you so much.
recordarles que esta sesión está siendo grabada en ambos
And I want to
idiomas.
remind you that this session is being recorded in both languages, English and Spanish, and that it's going to be available on the site. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend.
Hasta luego. Gracias.
Goodbye.
Gracias. Chao.
hasta luego.
Bye bye.